So, good evening, Upper Valley. My name is Casey Carpenter, and like many of you, I am in need of a haircut. I will be your host tonight for the first ever Mudroom event. This is the virtual event of the Mudroom, and we want to thank everybody for coming out. A couple quick house cleaning rules. You will have access to the chat throughout the evening. We will be moderating it, so please make sure you keep it clean and fun. Please, we're getting a couple comments in. If you have no audio, please look in the bottom left corner and turn on the audio for your computer. We ask that on the upper right-hand corner or the upper left-hand corner, you can switch it to either speaker view or gallery view to see the speakers throughout the evening. At the end of the night, we will be doing a Q&A session in which you can use the chat function to ask the Mudroom board or the storytellers themselves some questions, and we'll try to address any questions you may have. Our sponsor tonight is Three Tomatoes, located in Lebanon. Three Tomatoes is open Tuesday through Sunday from 4 p.m. to 7:30, and they are still taking takeout orders. Three Tomatoes has been a proud supporter of Ava Gallery for the last 30 years, so we thank them for sponsoring and hope you give them some of their business over the weekend. Speaking of Ava Gallery and Art Center, that's our typical home here for the Mudroom. Not many people know, but Ava Gallery, just ahead of the pandemic, rewrote their mission statement. Their mission statement says that as a catalyst for creativity, Ava Gallery cultivates an openness of space and mind to inspire, nurture, and showcase the artistic spirit. And in that line, they've continued through the pandemic to offer courses online, to put content online, and to support us at the Mudroom as we move the Mudroom online. So we ask that as they stand up a fund of the From Here to There in order to accrue donations to maintain their ability to operate throughout the pandemic, that if you guys enjoy the show this evening or what Ava Gallery has to offer through their online content, please be willing to make a donation. I'd like to reiterate on the From Here to There Foundation that a generous donor has made a $50,000 challenge in which if we can raise $50,000 in the From Here to There campaign, they will match the $50,000. We've already raised $14,000 of that, so we're looking for another $36,000. If you can support $10, which would be the typical cost of a Mudroom ticket, we'd be very excited for that. And without further ado, we're going to get to our first storyteller. Our first storyteller tonight is Bartlett Labor. She is a retired general counsel, an aspiring artist, and she is a lover of chickens, dogs, cats, and ducks. She's here to share a story tonight about one of those animals. And Bartlett, the floor, or should I say screen, is now yours.
Thank you, Casey. My story starts almost 25 years ago when my husband and I first got together. And at that time, we had 5 kids between us. 3 of them were based in Vermont, 2 of them were based in Boston. We both had jobs in Boston, although my husband's job was also based in New York. And basically, we started this lifestyle of being on the road constantly, so that we could get our whole family together in Vermont on the weekends, and Vermont kind of became home, and we used to call it our emotional home. And then Boston was a place where some people went to school, people worked, and we just went back and forth and back and forth. Eventually, the kids got big, and they went off to school and did all the other things that kids do, but we still loved Vermont, and Vermont was still home. So my husband and I continued on our road of just going back and forth every week, week after week, while we were still working. And someplace along that route, I realized that what I wanted more than anything in the world was chickens. And chickens, because if I could live in a place where I had chickens, then I would definitely be home. I'd be home all the time, and I'd have eggs, and it would be just a wonderful experience for me. So chickens kind of became this symbol of domestic life, of being settled, of being together with your family. So 5 or 10 years ago, my husband and I moved, actually it was more like 10 years ago, my husband and I moved to the Upper Valley. We were still working, but in the past couple of years, we've managed to retire and not be traveling back and forth to Boston all the time. And I got a call last spring from the most wonderful woman, my dear friend, Leanne Tomashow. And she said, Bartlett, I'm coming over to your house and I'm bringing you 4 chickens. And this was last March. And I said, okay, Leanne, that's great. Bring me the chickens, because she understood how I felt about them. And she brought them over, and there were these wonderful 4 birds. There was Big Red. She was the Rhode Island Red, who was sort of the alpha chicken of all of them. And then there was a Lacey Wyandotte, who was double mint. And then there was Chicklet. And then there was this one last chicken named Bazooka. And it was really wonderful. The chickens wandered around the yard. They did all the chicken things that they do. Everybody was happy. The dog liked them. The cat liked them. It was just exactly the peaceable kingdom that I'd always fantasized about. And then one day, Bazooka turned up a little bit sick. She was hanging around outside of her pen. She wasn't really acting the way the other chickens were, and I was kind of worried about her. The next day, she didn't even come out of the little enclosure that's right near the pen. She sort of stayed right there at the door. And then on day 3, she didn't even get out of her nest. And I thought, I got to do something about this. So I called Leanne. And you have to understand about Leanne, because she is this woman who is, I think she's a genius, honestly, but she was born and raised in South Africa. She's trained as a designer in New York. She's a gifted artist. She has this giant horse that she gallops through the woods. She raises sheep and chickens and cooks like a Michelin chef. I mean, she's just remarkable in every sense of the word. And she's also just a force of nature. So if Leanne tells you you're doing something, you do it. So I call Leanne. I say, Leanne, Bazooka's sick. I don't know what to do about it. And she says, Bartlett, what you need to do is give the chicken a half a teaspoon of whiskey. I'm like, okay, that's great. How do you give a chicken a half a teaspoon of whiskey? Well, you open her beak and you pour it in. So I'm saying, okay. So I go into the house and I look through the liquor cabinet and I come up with this. This is a bottle of Johnnie Walker Black Label that had been in my in-laws' house when they passed away in 2012. And I got this out, the little measuring spoon, and I got this out, a little straw, and I sucked up, well, actually probably closer to a teaspoon of whiskey, and kind of kept it in the straw. And I go out to the little chicken coop, and there's poor little Bazooka, and I kind of get her in my arm and kind of pry it open and hold up the straw and let it go. And the chicken goes, and her little eyes become like little slit, I mean, dead chicken is just a thing, the neck gets really long and the eyes all close and it's just all of a thing in your lap. I'm just sitting here like, oh my God, the chicken died. So I go get a shovel and I dig a hole and, there rested Bazooka. And I come back inside and I'm really kind of upset about this. And I call Leanne and I go, Leanne, the chicken died. And she goes, yeah, I thought that might happen. But she died happy. Thank you for listening to my story. And if you can, please remember the Ava Here to There Fund. That's it.
Thank you so much. I had a little research department pull out fun facts for each story, and there are more chickens on Earth than people, coming in at a whopping 25 billion chickens. So don't feel one that got away. But without further ado, we'll move on to our second storyteller. Our second storyteller is Joe Frazier. He's slowly become a veteran of storytelling here in the Upper Valley. And how him and his Barbara, his wife of the last 43 years, found themselves living in Vermont. So thank you, Joe.
So the best advice, the worst advice. So I heard both of those things in the late summer and early fall of 1977. I was living in the Boston area with my new wife and our baby boy, driving around town in our new GMC cargo van, which we plan to convert into a camper. The two of us in the front, and our baby boy and his carrier sliding around in the back as the cargo. Occasionally, I would hit the brakes a little too hard, and he would slide along the floor and bang into our center console. I would look back and ask, "You okay, buddy?" And seeing a smile, I would hit the gas, and he would slide right back into position again. During our drives, we discussed a change, not only of location, but a way of life. The Back to the Land movement was underway. We had spent a good part of that summer in a small valley in Thetford, Vermont, helping my brother-in-law and his wife build a barn. We skinny dipped in a stream to bathe, and we ate around a picnic table at night. When I mentioned that I would love to live that way, I was told, "You need to commit, just do it." The best advice. That was on a Sunday, and during our ride home, we made our decision. The following day, we began giving our notices at work to our landlady and telling our family and friends of our plans. Don't do it. You will never last. What are you going to do up there? The worst advice. Well, at the end of the month, we packed our belongings, put the baby in the car seat, and headed north. We would spend the fall and the part of the winter living with my brother-in-law and his wife in a small farmhouse heated by a stove in which we burned small blocks of wood we gathered from a local factory. We slept on a mattress, placed on the floor of an uninsulated attic, and saw nights that reached 40 below and days that never reached zero. We were flatlanders, people who would need to be rescued. My wife and I found jobs working at Dartmouth, and I in the dish room, and she as a blue lady passing out meals to Dartmouth undergrads. One evening, as I headed home alone, I crossed the bridge between Hanover and Norwich and lost control of that van. The bridges really do freeze over here. Thank God I was alone on the bridge because I needed all of it. Back and forth, lane to lane, I went trying to stay out of the Connecticut River and just reached the other side. It was not to be. The van impacted on the decorative abutment on the Norwich side, stood on its front wheels, and spun around backwards. Well, the accident had begun in the state of New Hampshire, hitting a bridge, and ended in the state of Vermont, crossing the state line. And if you'd like to find a way to create a lot of paperwork for yourself for about a month, that's the way to do it. So that van, our pride and joy, was replaced with a secondhand VW Bug. And that would be our transportation for the rest of the winter. One morning, it was so cold, not a single car in our little valley would stop. After talking to our neighbor, Mickey, a plan was hatched. Mickey built a fire in his driveway, just in front of the truck. And we built up that fire and then let it die down. And 2 coals. At that point, everybody behind the truck and push. Once the engine was positioned over the coals, the oil warmed, the battery regained a charge, and the truck started. We then drove the Mickey's truck around to the other cars and got them started. A truly Vermont solution. On another trip home, I needed to travel through a snowstorm in the VW Bug, notorious for very little heat, by the way. The snow was deep enough that I decided to avoid a steep hill along my usual route. The alternate road that I chose was less steep, but much less traveled. About halfway home, I ran off the road and got stuck. What to do? I gave up and sat there with the lights on and the car running, and eventually I fell asleep. It would be the next morning before my rescuer arrived. Well, the first thing he saw as he came upon my car was a large snowball sitting there with the lights on inside and a stream of smoke coming out the back. So he walked up to the car, cleaned off the driver's window, and saw me slumped over the wheel. He, of course, assumed I had died. Well, he opened the door, and with that, I awakened, jumped. He jumped even higher than I did. Well, I was at least rescued, and in a little while, I was out of the snowbank and on my way home. When I finally did arrive back at the house, my wife, who was beside herself for the entire night, told me that she, in fact, had called the police. And even the police would not go out in that storm. As a matter of fact, they consoled her by telling her not to worry. I was probably with my girlfriend. Well, that was the beginning of our life in the Upper Valley. We've never regretted it. We've never looked back. The end of my story.
Thank you, Joe. I had a quick fun fact about the 1970s, which is at the beginning of the decade, the average price of gas was 36 cents a gallon. So at least you were getting around cheaply while you were crashing all those cars.
Very true.
Thank you so much, Joe. I did have a message from the executive director at Ava Gallery. She said that there was a $15,000 pledge in addition to the $14,000 that was already raised. So we're looking for another $20,000 to meet the $50,000 challenge in the From Here to There fund. So any support you guys can give throughout the night would be really appreciated, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Next up, we have Judith Hertog, not only a member of the Mudroom board, but she's also a writer, a journalist, and a teacher. Originally from Amsterdam, Judith then traveled throughout the world before setting up home here in the Upper Valley. And tonight, Judith is going to share a story from those travels. So Judith, the floor is yours. Oh, Judith, you got to unmute your video.
I'm sorry, I did not unmute myself.
It's okay.
I was saying that it's a strange experience to be talking into my computer. Thank you all for being here. Am I online now? Okay. So my story is about the year 1999 when I spent 5 months illegally teaching English in Lhasa, Tibet. And when I was young, I had read a lot of old travel accounts from explorers who had been to Tibet, and I had always dreamt of being an explorer myself. So as a student, my dream was, when I finished my studies, to find a job in Lhasa and try to spend as much time as possible there and write about my experience. But it wasn't so simple to arrange that because Tibet is occupied by communist China, and most Tibetans do not like the Chinese government, would rather have independence. So there is a lot of tension in Tibet, and the Chinese authorities do not like foreigners to be there to witness all that tension. So there were severe travel restrictions. And at that time, the only way a foreigner could be in Tibet was as part of a tour group under the supervision of a tour guide, a government-approved tour guide who could keep an eye on people. But I got really lucky because it turned out that at the university where I was a student, we had this guy who was visiting from Tibet on some kind of an exchange program. And a friend introduced me to him, Tsering, and he had a language school, an evening school for adults in Lhasa, and he invited me to come teach for him in return for room and board. And of course, I jumped at the occasion. I didn't have much time to get to know Tsering because he went back to Lhasa just a few days after I met him. But a few months later, I arrived in Lhasa, and it turned out he was kind of a big shot in Tibet, in the city. He picked me up in his big new car, and he brought me to his nice house where I was staying with him and his family. And I figured to be that successful in Tibet, you either have to have really good connections or something fishy is going on. And on the one hand, I was kind of reassured that he was somewhat powerful because I thought I was doing all this illegal stuff because I was in China. I had only a tourist visa for China, but I was not part of a tour group as I was supposed to be. I did not have a work permit to be working in Lhasa. And I also was planning to write some journalism, some articles about Tibet, which I was not at all supposed to do, and which I also did not tell Tsering. But I was kind of reassured that he was a bit of a big shot, and maybe he could arrange it that I could be there without getting in trouble. On the other hand, I was also a bit worried because I didn't really know why he had invited me and what his plan for me was. And if you have never lived under a totalitarian regime, the thing is, it's really confusing. I knew that in Tibet, everybody was being monitored and there was surveillance everywhere, but I was not ready for how disorienting it is to never know who to trust. And also how confusing it is that there are all these rules that everybody is circumventing, and you never know what are the rules that actually have to be observed and at what point the police will come in and arrest you. So for example, I was staying at Tsering's house, which was supposedly illegal. And he was kind of worried about me and told me not to tell anybody that I was staying with him. But all the neighbors knew I was there. And he didn't seem to be worried about that. And I figured it turned out that he was a member of the local, of some wing of the local Communist Party. But it was also clear that he didn't have that much love for the Communist Party. But I never exactly could figure out what his positions were because he avoided talking about anything sensitive or political. He was very careful. And he warned me that I had to be careful when I was teaching because some of the students could be spies. And then the other thing he worried me about was that in the teacher who taught a class after me in the evening, his name was Pempa, his daytime job was as a police officer. And Tsering said that I better stay away from Pempa because if Pempa knew I was teaching illegally without a permit, he might have to report me. So my students were younger people, my age, in their 20s, and they were much, much less careful than Tsering was. In their very limited English, they would often make jokes against the government, which made me really nervous because I didn't know if they were spies who were just saying things to provoke me or the other students. So I never really knew how to react. And then, of course, I was always worried about Pempa showing up and listening in. And I was always careful to try to get out of there as soon as possible to avoid Pempa. But as I got to know my students better and became friends with some of the students, we would often go out for noodles after class. And one time, one of my students tells me, you know, Tsering, boss of the language school, he communist. You be careful of Tsering. But this student, who was a friend of mine, of course, did not know that I was living with Tsering. Because I had to keep all these lies going to various people to protect all their secrets. And the thing I was worried about most wasn't myself. Because I knew that as a foreigner, the worst thing that could happen to me if I got arrested, I would be deported, my stuff would be confiscated, maybe, and I would never be allowed back into China. But I knew that as a foreigner, I would not be sent to a prison camp. But I was worried that with my actions or by associating with people, I would get others in trouble. And that I was of course keeping a travel journal, that I would somehow incriminate people with the things I was writing. And I was really, really nervous about that. But despite all that tension and anxiety, I really loved being in Tibet. And the problem was after 3 months, my tourist visa to China was up. And I couldn't renew it. It was impossible. And Cedric tried to pull some strings for me, but he wasn't that powerful. He wasn't able to renew my visa, and he wanted me to stay too and continue teaching for him. So his advice to me was to, as a last resort, see if you can approach Pempa, and if you're friendly with him, maybe he can pull some strings and get someone to renew your visa. So I thought I had this really devious plan. I waited after class to run in to Pempa, and I started talking to him. And when Pempa meets me, he actually tells me that he had been hoping to meet me because he had heard about my presence, but he had never had a chance to talk to me. And it was really nice. He was really nice, but he had to go teach. But as I had hoped, we made a dinner appointment. So Pempa takes me out for dinner to this fancy restaurant, and we order food, and he orders drinks, and he orders more drinks. And of course, I cannot start off immediately by bringing up my visa problem. And I also don't want to talk about anything that's too sensitive or political. So we talk about matters of the heart. And it turns out that Pempa has just broken up with his girlfriend, the love of his life. And he is really, really heartbroken. And more than that, he's in a really, really bad place. And he tells me also that he has just been to a funeral of a colleague who died young in a car accident. And Pempa is drinking, and I can see he's just kind of falling apart and telling me about how bad he feels. And I've been waiting for my opportunity to bring up my visa. But of course, the opportunity has passed. And then Pempa turns to me and asks me, "So what are you doing in Lhasa? Tell me a little bit about yourself." And I feel really bad because he's been pouring his heart out to me. And I have been here like stringing him along, trying to get my visa renewed. And I don't know, in some kind of impulse, I decide to just be honest with him. And I tell him that I'm in Lhasa because this is my dream, to spend time in Tibet and write about my experience. And instead of arresting me for all the illegal stuff I'm doing, Pempa's reaction is, "I really envy your life. I wish I could follow my dreams the way you are." And then he tells me about himself, and he explains that when he was a child, his parents were poor villagers, but he was selected to go to some special, very competitive boarding school in China, where he learned Chinese and English and was trained to become a police officer. And he describes himself as the lost generation of Tibetans because he never learned his own culture. He never even properly learned how to read and write in Tibetan. And he says he grew up into someone who doesn't have any ideals or any beliefs or any foundation to who he actually is as an identity. And then he whispers, "And I don't even believe in communism." And he tells me that he never wanted to be a police officer and that his life feels really meaningless to him. And he turns to me and says, I would rather be a teacher. I just feel my life has no meaning. What do you think I should do? Well, of course, my opportunity to ask for a visa extension is completely lost. And I'm young and stupid and naive. And my response is, maybe we live to pursue our dreams. Maybe you should quit and find a job that's more meaningful to you, which is not the advice you give to someone who's trying to survive under a totalitarian regime. Pursuing your dreams is not your priority in that case. But anyway, Pempa thanked me for the advice, and at the end of the dinner, he told me that he had never had such an honest conversation with anybody. And I felt like such a hypocrite. and such a failure. I hadn't even asked him about the visa. But when I told Tseng about my failure to ask for a new visa, apparently Tseng went back and asked Pempa to renew my visa. And I did get to stay 2 more months in Lhasa in the end. And I did get to write about my experience. And I would say I even got to live pretty much my dream life. But now when I learn about what's going on in Tibet, and things have only gotten worse. You may read about it in the news. When I read about the prison camps, people being arrested, I think of Pempa, and I wonder if what he ended up doing, if he's still a police officer. And on the one hand, I kind of hope that he followed my advice. And on the other hand, I worry what happened to him if he did. Thank you. That's my story.
Thank you so much, Judith. And I got a fun fact about Tibet from the old Google machine. 47% of the world's population depends on the flow of fresh water from Tibet. So I don't know if you knew that, but little caveat to add on the story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next storyteller is Chico Eastridge, and Chico was a late addition, so I actually do not have a bio. So I'm going to give you the 2 things I know about Chico, which is that he works at CATV and that he once got arrested for playing bocce ball or croquet. Either way, he's here to share an adventure story with you tonight. So Chico, the floor is yours.
Hello, Video Rangers. Welcome to my basement. How's it going? I think I did actually send a bio. I sent it late, but it was just the opening narration to Quantum Leap. So you can find that online if you just type in Quantum Leap, opening narration. I'm glad to be here. It's so exciting. My cat is really psyched, pumped to hear this story. The furnace laughs at all my jokes. And I've been staying mentally active. Today I made a little puppet out of a potato. So, you know, that's good. It, you know, really keeps the mind going, which is so important these days, you know. Got to keep busy. But anyhow, it was probably about 2003 or so, and I got a call from Shab. And Shab, we called him Shab because his last name was Chabot, well, still is. But people sometimes mispronounce it Shabbat, and so we called him Shab, as is the way of teenagers. And he called me and he said, "Do you want to go rafting?" And I said, okay. And we'd never done this before. He had a raft, but it was kind of like a pond raft, you know, to give you a mental image of its seaworthiness. It may have had cup holders. And so we decided to go down the Pompanousek River in Thetford, which is as much a river as Lake Champlain is a Great Lake, or Price Chopper is an all-night nightclub. They have music and they're open late, but you and your friends can't just hang out there, apparently. But anyhow, so it was a serene, placid ride. It's quaint and wholesome as can be. And then we came to a waterfall, and the current was moving slow enough that we could pull off to the side, and we did, and we got out and we looked at it, and it was like a waterfall. And Shab said, "I think we can go down that." And Shab's pretty smart. I mean, currently his job is he scales cliffs into golden eagle nests with a golden eagle on his back for science, apparently. So I think you got to be pretty smart to do a thing like that. So I trusted him. And so we got back in the raft and we started rowing up to it. And I had a bad feeling about it. And then we got like pretty much over the edge, and I was looking down and I had a bad feeling about it. And then we were falling and I felt bad. And the boat hit the water and it went under and it got lodged underneath this rock and just kind of held us like a nice rubber hammock, and everything was fine. And so from that moment forward, we were experts in whitewater rafting. So it was probably about 2 weeks later, I got another call from Shab. I think in the time in between, we may have burnt down a house, but Shab told me never to talk about that. So it was 2 weeks later and nothing of consequence had happened in between. And he said, the Queechy Gorge Dam just broke. You want to go rafting? I said, sure. He said, we have to go pick up my friend Ben. I was like, who's Ben? He's like, he's my friend. I haven't seen him since kindergarten. And I don't really know how you maintain a friendship like that over 14 years, but whatever. We picked up Ben, and Shab said, what you been up to? And he said, not much. So we had this guy that hadn't been up to much for about 14 years. And we drove off to the Quechee Gorge. This time we were a little bit more prepared than we were on the Unpompanoosic River because we brought bike helmets. We thought we were pretty fancy with that. And we went out on the bridge. We decided we were going to do a little bit of recon. And we looked down and, you know, it was what the casual observer may describe as the gaping maws of death. It was just like this brown snake, like flying down this gorge at like 100 miles an hour. Is the kind of like torrent that when you're sitting on a river and looking at kind of the granite slabs that contain the river, and you wonder, how could water be so powerful to shape that rock? This was the kind of water that doesn't make you wonder that anymore. So we looked down at it, and Shab said, we just need to avoid that spot. And he was pointing at this one spot that was just, it was just terrible. You know, it was like, you know, the poster to A Perfect Storm. It was like this tidal wave, but instead of like a fishing boat, it was we would have a raft, and everything else was rocks. So that was good advice. Just avoid that spot. But the thing about a river is it's kind of like an A to B sort of system. You know, it's like, especially in really fast moving water that you can't get out of, you can't really like avoid a spot. But we decided we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. So we hopped a fence near the dam and started climbing down this cliff that was like inexplicably covered with broken glass. Just like every inch of it was just shards of glass. And we were trying to keep the raft from popping. And so we were like holding it out. It was deflated. And we were just like raking our body against this glass covered cliff. And we got down to the bottom somehow, and we started pumping it up. And then we realized we didn't have the cap for the raft. We'd lost it somewhere along the way. So we climbed back up the cliff and scoured the cliff, found the little nozzle, brought it back down, and plugged it on the raft. And so we started getting in the raft, and we noticed that there was people and some cops up on the dam, and they were going like this. And so we went, hi, and they were going, and we were going, hi, and we got in the raft and got in the river. And it was like really, really going. We were like really battling the waves. Shab was in the front, I was in the back, and we were keeping the raft straight, even though it's like, I don't really know if that matters at all. And Ben was in the middle. We'd given him a bucket, and he was bailing out the water. And then we started getting closer to the bridge, and we got to the part that Shab had said we should avoid. And that's when it happened. I got the worst advice of my life. Shab turned around and he said, make sure we don't flip over, which in itself is not terrible advice, but there should be some like prerequisite advice to go with it. Like, don't. There's also like some things about it that are kind of futile. It's kind of like saying, make sure the sun doesn't come up, make sure to go back in time and prevent the fall of Rome, make sure to change the gravitational constant of the universe and rearrange atomic bombs to create new and interesting attributes to common material. That is to say, a few seconds later, I was underwater and I was floating, and it was cold and dark, but I had a helmet on, and I thought, I'll just hold my breath. I'm pretty good at holding my breath. I'll be buoyant. Eventually, I'll float back to the surface. I might get a little bit banged up, but everything's going to be okay. Floated back up to the surface, and it was just like foam everywhere and crashing waves, and I just couldn't see much, and I couldn't see anybody, and I was thinking, don't panic. You're going to make it through this. And then I looked over to my side, and my bike helmet was floating next to me. And I reached out to grab it and immediately got sucked back under. And so I was underwater for, about 15 hours, and I was floating there, and it was cold and it was dark. I couldn't see and I couldn't hear. And I was wondering, will I know if I die? And it's like, I don't mean to get like all Assyrian on my models of the afterlife, but cold and dark seems like, a plausible situation to be in when you die. So eventually I came back up to the surface. I was relieved by that, but immediately I ran into this like giant rock. And if you've ever wondered what it's like to break your femur, imagine holding your leg like a baseball bat and just hitting it as hard as you can against an immovable object. And then it's more painful than that, probably, because I hadn't actually broken my femur. It just hurt so much, I figured it must be broken. But I managed to crawl out and onto the bank. I flopped myself down on the granite, and I was cold and scared, and I looked up at the bridge, which was right above us, and there's these two people with cameras looking down at us, or me, and I waved up at them. I was like, "Help!" And they waved back down, "Hi!" And I waved up, "Help!" And they waved back down, "Hi!" And, that was when I lost all hope in communication with human beings. But so I started crawling up the rock, the bank, and I got to the top of it. I put my hand up, and another hand came from over the other side. And I lifted myself up. I was so excited, and it was Ben. I was like, "Oh, hi, Ben." And he said, "Look." And he held up the bucket, and he still had it. And I was like, great. And then I heard from behind me, "Help!" And we looked, and Shab was up against this cliff, and next to him was this giant whirlpool. Like, I didn't even think that these things occurred naturally. It was like Charybdis. And I managed to get myself up on one leg, and I said one of the stupidest things I've ever said in my life. I said, "Don't worry, we'll help." But he was on the other side of the river, and it was just like a complete implausible situation that we would be able to provide him with any help whatsoever. If Shab at that time had his rock climbing abilities, he probably could have just scampered right up the wall, but high school Shab was not there yet. So eventually he got tired and just let go, and he didn't get sucked down the whirlpool. So I guess even if they do exist in the wild, they're not actually that harmful. And he just kind of tumbled over some rocks and down the river a little bit more, and he eventually managed to get out of the river. And so, battered and beaten, we walked our way down the river after it calmed down, and got to this like swimming hole, and there were some people down there paddling around in the boat, and they were like, "Oh, does this belong to you guys?" Like, all this cool stuff just started floating down the river. We got this boat, these paddles, this pump, and Ben was like, "But you didn't get the bucket." And so we collected our things. We walked back up to the car in silence. We sat there for a long time, and then we scrounged around the car for quarters and split an ice cream float. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chico. I think you're going to really enjoy this fun fact. When I Googled fun facts about rafts, it came back as, and you can Google this to check, canoes are small, paddles propelled the boat.
Canoes are small. You could build a big canoe, couldn't you?
This is what Google gave me as the fun fact about rafts.
That is fun to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chico. I'd like to, if you guys are enjoying the show, we've been right around 160 participants throughout the duration of the show. So our next story is going to come from Margot O'Day. Margot is a lifelong resident of the Upper Valley. She has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And tonight she's going to share a story of the advice her mother gave her the first time that she was expecting. So Margot, the floor is yours.
Well, this story starts when I was growing up. I grew up in Enfield, New Hampshire. We moved up there when I was 11 or 12. And I lived on top of Jones Hill. And instructions to get to Jones Hill were, you go past the town dump. Then you go around the big tree, past the dump house, and up a giant hill. At the top of the giant hill, there's a 4 corners. You take a left, go up another hill, and they live in that little red house. So summer was coming. We'd moved up there in April, and I was looking forward to it. Me and my friends were going to go to the beach and tan. I was going to read books and just relax for the summer. At the time, I had 4 brothers, Donnie, Bruce, Pat, and Mark, and they were all younger than me. So first day of summer vacation, my plans are made. And I come out to the living room, and my mom's sitting there, and she's smoking her cigarette and reading the paper, and my brothers are at the dining room table filling their face as usual. And my mother says, "So, what are you doing?" I said, "Well," anytime my mother asks me what I'm doing, it's a question I really got to think about, because what does she want to know why? So I said, "Well, I'm going to read. I'm going to go to the beach and tan with my friends, go swimming with my friends." You know, my mother said, "I don't think so, little Miss Muffet," which was the name that she called me when she was really mad. "This summer, you're going to take care of your brothers. You're going to go and pack lunches, and you're going to go and you're going to take them somewhere. And I don't want to see you until dinner time." At this point, I did something I shouldn't do. And I told my mother, but I had plans. And my mother says, "When I was your age, I had plans too. But what did I do? I carried my infant brother across Germany, eating potatoes and being chased by Russians. And if you don't do this, I'm going to crack you so hard you're going to end up in the middle of next week." That was an indication that I had to do what she was told me to do. So that's where the bad advice comes in. My brothers were kind of unruly, but they always said, "Can we do this?" Because they knew I was a leader. And I'd say, "Sure, doesn't matter to me. Can we jump off this shed and with this parachute," which was a bed sheet? "Yeah, go ahead, jump." "Can we go swimming? Can we jump off the bridge?" "Of course you can jump off the bridge. You can dog paddle and I'll save you if you start to drown." And then one day, they wanted to make a go-kart. The easiest place to get stuff for a go-kart wasn't a hardware store. Excuse me. Wasn't a hardware store. It was a town dump. The dump was like a shopping mall for all the kids. At that time, there was no recycling. People just dumped everything. They dumped cars there, furniture, whatever. So we headed for the dump. And we get up there, and Mr. LeMay is there, sitting in a chair. Mr. LeMay lived in the dump house, and I think the town let him live in the dump house as long as he took care of the dump. And one of his jobs was to sit there and make sure people dumped stuff over the edge, which nobody ever did. And we asked him, "Can we find some wheels?" And he said, "Yeah, go ahead." And we're looking for wheels, and we find a carriage, one of the old-time carriages that had the big wheels. This was great. This was like a find. And Mr. LeMay saying, "Oh yeah, you can have that. By the way, go see if that bottle over there. See that bottle over there?" And my brothers go over. He said, "See if it's got any liquor in it and give it to me." And they do it. And Mr. LeMay would take it and bring it home with him. And I guess he drank it. So we're lugging this car. These baby carriages were big. They were made out of metal. And they had big wheels. They were perfect for making a go-kart. So we're taking it up this hill. And this hill is steep. In the winter, it's almost impossible to get up. Usually people went up Kluger's Road. So we get almost to the top of the hill. And one of my brothers says, "You know what? I bet it'd be a good ride down this hill in this baby kart. What do you think?" I said, "Yeah. Let's let Mark do it." Mark was the fall guy for us because he'd do anything we told him to. So we put my brother Mark in the cart and we let him go down the hill. So he's going as fast as a car, basically. And he hit the tree. and fell out of the cart and just laid there. So we were like, oh, I said, I killed one of them. I'm in big trouble now. So we run down to the bottom of the hill, and Mark isn't dead. He had just fallen out of the cart and he'd skinned his knees. And one thing about kids, you don't tell your parents anything you did wrong, ever. Because in my house, it could get you killed. So, okay, I took him swimming. He's, washed off all the blood. And throughout my life with my brothers, I've usually given them wrong advice. Don't marry that girl. She's too smart for you. He married her. They're still together 37 years later. Or, sure, you can drive. You don't have a license? That's not a problem. Just drive. Just don't drink any more beer. But eventually I moved out of the house and I got married. And my husband said, maybe we should have some children. This was my biggest fear, because growing up with all these kids, it was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do this. And I said, who's the best person to ask for advice about? My mother. My mother had 7 kids. And, when my mother was pregnant, she looked like she had a basketball in the front. She didn't gain any weight. My mother weighed 98 pounds, soaking wet, was 5'1". So I went up to my mom's and I said, Ma, how hard is it to have a baby? I mean, when my mother went to the hospital, she'd say, oh, Donald, it's time to go. My dad would load her in the car. They'd go to the hospital. 3 days later, she'd come back with a baby. I didn't have anything to do with the little ones because she breastfed, so I obviously couldn't do that. And I wasn't good with the needle. Back then, there was pins and cloth diapers, and I definitely wasn't good with that after I poked the kids a few times. She gave them to me once they were toilet trained, could eat on their own, and could talk. And my mother says, oh, it's easy. It's the easiest thing you can do. She goes, I never complained, but back then you didn't complain because they never taught you anything like that. There was no sex ed, and nobody talked about babies or the pain of it or anything because you just didn't talk about birth. There were no nice little movies that showed you, oh, this is what happens. So I was sort of, I said, okay, does it hurt? She goes, well, it hurts a bit, but not a lot. And I'm thinking, okay, so I got pregnant. And I had the easiest pregnant ever. I thought it was wonderful. I ate anything I wanted. I had this thing for grilled cheese, mustard, and pickle sandwiches. I'd eat 2 or 3 of them at a time. I gained 75 pounds. That wasn't a good part of it. But I went into labor. My husband had gone to work. He worked at Dartmouth College at the time. And my neighbor was going to give me a ride to the hospital. So I said, come on, let's go. We get out to the car and our water pump blows. So neither one of us had a phone. So the next step was we're going to walk down to the drugstore, Lucian's drugstore. We walked down there and I had like twinges. There was no huge pain. I said, okay. I walk in and Chief LeBounty is sitting there drinking coffee and Lucian is there and my water breaks. And I didn't know this was going to happen. I was like in shock. And Lucian said, you're having a baby. I said, yeah, I know. But so Chief LeBounty says, get in the car. And me and my friend get in the car, in the police cruiser, and he puts the siren on and takes me to Hanover. So I'm thinking, okay, well, these pains haven't been that bad. This isn't going to be that bad. Back in the day, you didn't have a birthing room with, the sound, the music playing, and, people being nice to you. And this was like they shaved you in places you'd never been shaved, never wanted to be. They put you on a delivery table in stirrups, and then you were like in an operating room, and there were Dartmouth students around looking at your hoo-ha. And I was like embarrassed. At this time, my husband shows up, which really didn't make my day. And then the pain starts, and it was not as predicted. It wasn't my mother's, oh, it's not that bad. It was the worst thing I ever felt in my life. And I'm like, I felt really, I was mad. I was angry. My husband kept saying, push. I told him, get the hell out of this delivery room. And so I had this baby. This baby had a forceps delivery. which meant Stephen was born with a pointed head with little blonde spurts coming out of the top of it. And he happened to be a 10-pound baby, which could account for why it took so long. And after it was over with, I contemplated this, that I never want to do this again. And I took this baby home. I tried to breastfeed. The kid weighed 10 pounds. There's no way that was happening. And I was dumbfounded. I'm like, oh my God. So my mother comes to see the baby, and she's like, oh, da da da. I said, Ma, I thought you said it was easy. She goes, oh no, I never said it was easy. You just followed the advice I gave you. I said, yeah, and it's the worst thing I've ever done. She goes, I made it look easy because it was easy for me. And that's the worst advice I've ever gotten after giving years of advice. And after that, it took me 5 years to have my other son, Christopher, and another 5 years to have my daughter, because I didn't forget the pain. And that's the end of my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. I picked a fun fact to make you feel a little bit better, but the heaviest baby ever born weighed 22 pounds, 8 ounces, and he was born in Italy in 1955.
Oh, thank you very much for telling me that one.
I hope that makes you feel just a little bit better. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. If you too have had a child and they have nothing to do, please check out Ava Gallery's Chaos program that is still available in the community, and we hope to continue running if you donate to the From Here to There fund. So they also give us the opportunity here at the Mudroom to use their space, so any support you can give to Ava will continue to be appreciated. Our next storyteller is Levy. She is the owner of the recently opened up Still North Books and Bar in Hanover, a place that through quarantine I miss going to for a cup of coffee and a good read. But once upon a time, Allie was an undergraduate here at Dartmouth, and tonight she's going to share the story of how she circled back into town. So Allie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Casey. It's kind of a little bittersweet to be telling this story right now since we're not open, but also kind of nice to remember how it all started. So the worst advice that I ever got came in the form of a question, and it came repeatedly, and it came from, of all people, my therapist. I was living in Denver, and I was still seeing my therapist from New York, and he kept asking me over and over in every session, when are you going to move back to New York? So a few years before that, I had graduated from Dartmouth. I was not a particularly good student, but I always feel really grateful to Dartmouth for introducing me to the Upper Valley community that I love so much. I just immediately fell in love with the place. And then the other thing that I really got out of my Dartmouth experience was I met a really, really wonderful therapist. And so when the time came to graduate, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I decided everyone else is doing it, so what the hell, I'll move to New York. I had no idea what I was going to go do there. And my therapist from the Upper Valley gave me a referral. She highly suggested that I start seeing somebody when I moved to the city. And so I started seeing him, and it was really helpful. Like, I went from being anxious just to get on the subway to kind of starting to really love the city. I ended up working as the floor supervisor at an Eastern Mountain Sports in Soho, and I enjoyed it for a while. But after about a year and a half, coming up on 2 years, I started to just kind of get sick of the city, get sick of all of the people. It made me feel just mean to be in New York, like the people were in the way. And I also realized the irony of working in an outdoors store in New York City. So I thought I can do better. And I decided that I would pack up my stuff, move to Denver. So I moved to Denver. I started working in the outdoor industry, which made a lot more sense. I was climbing all the time, My job was in e-commerce, which now I'm really grateful for because e-commerce has become my job again. And I was having a lot of fun, but I started to feel that something was missing. I started to feel like I wasn't really making the most out of my degree. I wasn't doing anything in my field. And so I reconnected with my therapist from New York. And so he just kind of kept asking me, when are you going to move back to New York? And so I decided that I would quit my job at the American Alpine Club in order to intern for that same organization, because I wasn't really thinking logically, but I would intern on their publications. And since my background had been in English and I had worked on the paper, and I really missed just working with words and language and reading and writing all the time. So I decided I would intern on their publications and I would apply for the Columbia Publishing course. I ended up getting into the Columbia Publishing course, which is a 6-week intensive program in book publishing and magazine publishing. And so finally, when my therapist asked, when are you moving back to New York, I had an answer that summer. So I went and I did the course, and it was good. It was, you know, besides the dread of having to completely change careers, I really enjoyed it. And I saw my therapist in person. It was helpful as much as it could have been, just kind of checking in with a person. And so what surprised me most about the course, though, was I really fell in love with the book aspect. The course was split between book publishing and magazine publishing, and I thought that I would really love magazine publishing and think about something in outdoor journalism, but instead I just fell in love with the book world again, and it felt like reconnecting with this part of me from when I was younger. So I made the decision that I was going to pack up my belongings, go back to Denver, pack everything up, grab my cat, grab my stuff, sell my car, and move right back to New York and get a job in book publishing. But that's not what happened. Instead, I found myself looking at apartments with another New York escapee. And on one of those apartment trips, I stumbled across this little bookstore / bar in a corner of Denver called Tennyson. It was called Book Bar. And I just fell in love instantly. And so I told my therapist, I'm not coming back. I'm going to do this. I ended up working at Book Bar. I became their events and marketing coordinator and just really loved it. I was climbing in my time off. I had a great group of friends. I lived in an apartment across from a park that had a little lake and a view of the mountains. And I would go have my therapy sessions in this park when it was nice out. And my therapist would say, when are you moving back to New York? And I would say, I don't think ever. I love it here. But eventually I started to get this nagging feeling again that I was in retail and that I wasn't making the most out of my degree. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to take his advice. I'm going to move back to New York. And so I did, completely ignoring the fact that when I first left New York, I did so because I hated it there, which my therapist fully knew. So I moved back to New York and I worked really hard for a few months. I moved in the beginning of fall, and by the holidays, I had found a job. I was running all the time, and I was eating really well and counting my calories and was really, really regimented and just a very on the outside, fulfilled, self-actualized human being, and it had paid off. And I had gotten this job in publishing at a publisher that I really loved. So if it wasn't my dream job, it was really, really close. And I would go to therapy, and I started to just dread it. Like it was a chore to drag myself to therapy. When I started my job, I remember telling my therapist how things were going and telling him about all of my routines and the fact that I would make my overnight oats and wake up super early and make sure that I got to work by 8:30, which if anyone knows me, that is not at all even close to who I am. And he was like, this sounds really great. This sounds great. Meanwhile, I told a friend at work that I was doing this, and they were like, this doesn't sound sustainable or okay. You're gonna, like, your world's gonna come crashing down around you, which was really, in retrospect, a really intense thing for somebody to say when they had only known me for a few months, but it was actually 100% true. So I started to dread therapy more and more, and it started to come out in therapy that I didn't like New York, but it came out in interesting ways. So it came out as me complaining about the fact that my package was getting stolen from my building's lobby. And my therapist said, well, why don't you put a security camera up? And I didn't really want that solution. I wanted to talk about the fact that I hate New York. And I said, no, I don't think that'll help. And he said, well, sure it will. I have one at my home in the Hamptons. Here, let's watch it. Which is a completely crazy way to be spending therapy. But at the time I thought maybe he's testing me. Maybe there's something here that I'm not getting. So I decided to talk to a friend about it. And she encouraged me to get a second opinion. And the first thing that popped into my brain was I should reach out to my therapist from college who referred me to this therapist 7 years ago. So I sent her an email and I was a little nervous and I heard back pretty quickly. And she said, yeah, let's get on a call and talk about this. So I told her what was going on. And I said, do you think that it's just I'm not doing a good job in therapy? Am I doing something wrong? And she said, let me get this straight. You're calling me, your therapist from 7 years ago, who you haven't talked to ask if therapy is okay for you right now. I think it's not. I don't think you're in the right therapeutic relationship, which was a relief to me to hear. And so I kind of tentatively said, could you be my therapist again? I was probably as bad a patient in therapy in college as I was a student. So I thought she was going to say absolutely no way. But to my surprise and happiness, she said, you know what, I think we could give it a shot. She was a little bit hesitant because of the whole remote therapy thing, which now seems completely insane because all we do is teletherapy. But we decided to give it a shot. And so that following week, going to therapy in New York to tell my therapist that I was dumping him for my therapist of 7 years ago, I was the most excited about therapy that I had been in years. So I went and I told him, this isn't working out. I'm going to start seeing the person who referred me to you, who is also your former student. And he took it pretty well. He said, yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea. So free of my New York therapist, I started to settle into my life in New York and realize how much I hated it. And because my therapist was now up in the Upper Valley, I had the occasion to start visiting here more. And really early on, one of the first visits to see her in person, I remember saying, I just want to move here and I want to open a bookstore. And at this point, it was just a fantasy. And she said, is this really what you want to be talking about in therapy? Thinking it was just a dream and it was a waste of our time. And I said, you know what, I think it is. But at that time, the Dartmouth bookstore was still around, so there really wasn't any reason for me to open a bookstore in Hanover beyond thinking that the community really deserved an independent local business as opposed to a Barnes & Noble that didn't have much character left anymore. So I continued seeing my therapist up here remotely. And then a few months after I first really recognized that dream and started to realize how much I missed bookselling and how much I missed the area, I heard the news that the Dartmouth bookstore was closing. And that's when I started really putting in the work to see if that's something that I could do, move back here and open an independent bookstore and cafe where the Dartmouth bookstore used to be. That all worked out until coronavirus, but it turns out that the worst advice to move back to New York might have been the best advice because it's what got me here, but I'm just not convinced that it was coming from someone who really should have been giving me advice at all. That's my story.
Thank you so much. And Allie, do you want to give a quick plug of what is the website and how is it currently working for ordering books if people are interested in getting books from Still North?
Yeah, we're selling books online, stillnorthbooks.com. For right now, we are only shipping. We want to encourage people to stay home and not make any non-essential trips to the bookstore. But we hope that once the worst of the threat has passed, that we might be able to offer curbside again soon. So hopefully sometime in May, we'll be starting back up curbside, books definitely, and potentially reintroducing some coffee and baked goods.
Great, and I will speak on behalf of many in the Upper Valley in that we miss being at Still North and spending time there. So
we miss you guys.
We look forward to coming back. I do got a fun fact for you. I had one and then I changed it because this one made me laugh a little bit. Fun fact, to write a novel, it takes about 475 hours. I have no idea how they would compute that or assume that everyone writes a novel in the same amount of time, but that was the fun fact that you get for the night. But thank you so much for sharing your story. And we have one story remaining. That story is going to come from Sue Schmidt. Sue is a teacher, stand-up comic, and a comedic storyteller. She's also the drummer for the Brevity Thing band, and she's a graduate professor in mental health counseling. Eclectic to say the least. Tonight, Sue takes us back to share a story from where it all began. So Sue, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So the worst advice I ever got came when I was 12, and it came from my best friend, Betty Ann DeCandia. And this was the advice. The advice was, you should join the boys' Little League team. Now, this advice was born out of a conversation that Betty Ann and I had had about the inequality of boys' uniforms versus girls' uniforms. So the girls' softball team had skirts. I don't know if you are familiar with this incredible, hideous 70s fashion statement, but think about it if a pair of shorts and a skirt had a baby. This is what was happening on the bottom half. And on the top half were New York Department of Physical Education issue white collar shirts with little snaps down the front. After the age of 4, snaps really shouldn't happen for anybody. The boys' uniform, conversely, had white knickers with turquoise pinstripes that went down the front. They had adjustable caps and 3/4 sleeve baseball shirts that on the front said the San Remo Screamin' Eagles, and on the back said Lanasa Sand and Gravel Dig It. I wanted this uniform more than anything I had ever wanted in my life. And so our plan was simple. We were going to send in the paperwork for Little League, and in the first name, I was just going to put an S instead of Suzanne, and they probably would never know the difference, and they would send me the uniform, and it would all be done. I had no intention of playing on the team. So this plan had 2 problems. One was, had they found out that I was a girl, girls were just not allowed to play Little League back in the 70s. That was just not a thing. And the other problem with this plan was that the games were on Sunday afternoons. And Sunday afternoon in my tribe was family dinner. Every man, woman, child were expected to show up at my grandparents' house and be there for a minimum of 4 hours. We would eat, we would argue, we would eat some more, we would argue some more, we would take a break, we would watch an episode of Mutual Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and then we would come back to the table and the stories would start. My family were amazing storytellers. And some of them were tales of people that I'd never met before, how my great-grandmother came into Ellis Island. And other of them were little anecdotes of things that might have happened during the week in people's regular workday. All of the stories were incredibly inappropriate for children. I loved family Sunday dinner. My spot was right in the middle of the bench. This was a 12-foot piece of mahogany that my grandmother had gotten from some church bazaar yard sale. And on one side, my cousin Jonathan, who was about 5 years older than I was and could do all kinds of incredibly interesting things with food. I once saw him take a piece of spaghetti, eat it in his mouth, and then pull it out his nose. On the other side, my favorite cousin, my cousin Joanne, 15 years my senior, and she was my kind of comic relief at all of this. And so while this was going on, she would lean over sometimes and just say, "Gosh, these people are nuts. I am so glad you and I are adopted." And so I sent in the application, and about 3 days later, I get a call, and it's Donna from Parks and Rec. Now, you all know Donna. Donna works in every town, in every city, in every state in the nation. Donna has the smallest amount of power of any civil servant, and she is not afraid to use it. And I overhear her talking to my mother, and she says, "I think that the S. Schmidt at One Landing Road is actually Suzanne Schmidt, and I think your daughter signed up for Little League, and she can't play Little League. She's going to need to play softball." Now, if Donna had just held for 5 seconds, it would have been over. And that would have been it. And my mother would have looked at me and said, you signed up for baseball. You should have signed up for softball. And I would have said, well, actually, no, I kind of want to play baseball. And my mother would have looked at me and said, stop being such a weirdo. You're not going to play baseball. And I would have said, okay, never mind. And it would have been over. But Donna couldn't wait. She had to just take that little ounce of power and use it. And she says to my mother in that judgy tone, you know the tone that Donna has, your girls can't play baseball. My family doesn't really know. And my mother took this as an opportunity to argue with Donna, which went on for about 5 minutes before Donna finally said, you need to take this up with the city council. And so my mother slams down the phone after we get a date for the meeting. And before I can say, look, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I just want the uniform. I really don't want to play baseball. My mother is ringing up the relatives, and they are mounting the posse and lighting the torches, and they are ready to ride. And so 2 days later, 16 members of my family show up at the city council. George Duncan, the head of the council, looks out into the audience and says, I just want to remind people that there's no speaking out of turn and there will be no outbursts. At which point my cousin Joanne leans over to me and says, fat chance of that happening. And so we wait our turn. And when our item comes up on the agenda, my father, who's been chosen to present, hands out a 6-page single-space typed report to the city council, outlining the history of baseball, some of the types of injuries, a couple of pages on the resilience of the mammary glands. This was my favorite part. And his summary was the Title IX legislation that has passed just a couple of years earlier. And to sum up, he looks at the council and says, if you have any questions, I would refer you to our attorney. And he gestures to my uncle. My uncle wasn't an attorney. My uncle actually had absolutely no connection to the law whatsoever. What my uncle did have was a very lovely leather briefcase that looked a lot like a briefcase an attorney would have. And so a couple of minutes of muted microphone talk of the city council, and they come back and they say, okay, we're gonna let your daughter play baseball. And there is an outburst in the gallery. And I'm thinking to myself, damn, I might actually have to show up and play baseball. This is going to be horrible. And so my family not only gives me special dispensation to not be at family dinner, they decide that they're going to show up at the games to cheer me on. And so I show up for practice and I get the uniform. And the San Remo Screaming Eagles are not the worst baseball team in the league. They are the worst baseball team in the history of baseball. We can't throw, we can't hit. It's not surprising. San Remo is a community of Italian immigrants, and we are not known for our speed or agility. What we are known for is our density and endurance, which, as it turns out, is a very good thing to have in Little League Baseball, because as you know, it can take hours to walk every member of that team around the bases. And so I'm sort of in the middle of the skill level. I can throw, I can catch, I can run, I cannot hit at all. But none of that really matters, because the fact is the coach is not going to put a girl on the field. And so the first game comes, and it's Sunday, and my entire family is there. I can't see them from the dugout, but I can smell them, because eggplants that's coated in olive oil and fried has a very pungent odor. So I know that they're there. And so little Vinny Tremarco and I sit on the bench because he is the worst player on the team for the entire game until the very last ups for the 6th inning. We are losing to the Comac Cougars 0-14. And finally, the coach looks at me and says, all right, I'll put you in. And I'm like, no. I'm just so good right here on the bench. This is like, I'm perfectly happy here. He said, no, get in there and just whatever you do, just swing, just swing. So I come out of the dugout and my family jumps to their feet and they are screaming. You would have thought Tom Seaver was taking the field at Shea Stadium for the Mets. It was unbelievable how loud they were cheering. And so I get up to bat, and the first ball comes across the plate, and I just stand there. And the second ball comes across the plate, and I just stand there. And now it's going to be the third strike. And the coach looks at me and he says, just swing. And so there comes the third pitch, and I swing. I more kind of swat at the ball. And remarkably, the bat connects to the ball, and the ball drops to the ground. And I'm so freaked out by the fact that I've hit this that I actually drop the bat. And as the bat is coming down, it hits the ball again, which I now consider a double. And the ball just kind of dribbles a couple of feet in front of me. And my family, again, screaming. And the coach is like, run! And I run. And I run to first, and I round first. And I get to second, and I'm coming around second. And I look back at my family, and I trip. And I'm halfway between second and third, and head first, I just dive and slide into third base. And now I'm safe on third base. And so the coach looks out at me, and he does this. I have no idea what this means. And so I do this back. And he says, timeout. And he comes out to the plate, and he says, you're going to steal home. And I was like, no, I'm so not going to steal home. I'm just going to wait here. Little Vinny Chimarco is just going to strike out, and everything's going to be done. And he said, no, you're going to steal home. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take a couple of steps off the base, and then you're going to stare down the pitcher. And then as soon as that ball leaves his hand, you're going to run. And he leaves, and we're back in the game. And so I take a couple of steps off the bag, and I look at the pitcher, and I stare him down, which looks like this. And the pitcher looks back at me, which looks like, but it's enough to confuse him that he actually gets a little bit thrown. And so he pays no attention to me, and he throws off the ball, and the second it leaves his fingers, I take off. And I can hear the screams from the crowd. I can smell the eggplant. I see little Vinny Chimarco standing on base looking at me like, no! And I say, get out of the way, I'm coming in. And I knock over little Vinny, and I knock over the catcher, and I'm landing on the ground. Just in time, I roll over and I look up, and there's the umpire, and he says, out. And that's it. And the game's over. And I walk back to the dugout, and the coach gives us some speech about excuses are the nails that built the house of failure. I don't know what the hell he was talking about, but I'm so humiliated because my family had really gone to bat for me to play. And I feel like I'd let them down. And so we get back in the car, and nobody says anything. And we drive back to the house, and 20 minutes later, there we are at the table, eating, arguing, more arguing. And then the stories start. And it's not a story of somebody long past that I don't remember, and it's not an anecdote of something that happened earlier in the week. It's a recap of the game. And my aunt starts, and she says, oh my gosh, I had no idea you could hit a casserole. And my uncle says, a bunt? Yeah, a bunt. And then my father jumps in, and he says, wow, the way you slid head first into third base, that was incredible. And then my grandmother says, when you stared down that pitcher, he was terrified. My cousin Joanne leans over, and she says, what the hell game were they watching? And then she said, you know what? It took a lot of guts to do what you do, kid. I'm proud of you. And that's when I knew. The next morning, I would call the coach, and I would quit the team. Not because we were the worst team in the league and we're probably going to lose every game, and not because my family was going to show up at every game and have an outburst, but because I knew it was clear that the team bench that I really wanted to sit on was right there in my grandparents' dining room. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. And I pandered to the crowd a little bit with your fun fact, but can you guess what the oldest Major League Baseball park is?
No, I can't. Oh, was it Chicago Stadium before they?
It's gonna be old Fenway Park, built in 1912.
Oh, good one.
Good old Boston.
Of course, Fenway is not my team. So go Mets.
Hence the Tom Seaver reference.
That's the Tom Seaver reference.
Well, thank you so much. I wanted to just really quickly to everyone, while we have to remain distant, I want to reiterate that we don't have to not be social. And what we're trying to do here is to continue to be social while we're in quarantine. We get to do that because we're doing it on behalf of AVA. And just a quick reminder that AVA has the From Here to There fund, and there's been a $50,000 challenge. So know that if you donate to that fund, your donation's really going to be doubled, and it's going to allow us to continue doing what we're doing tonight.